Hello, my name is Shveta, and I'm going to be talking about the development of space exploration from the 1940s to present day. For a little bit of background, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA, was the precedor to current-day NASA and was created on March 3, 1915. This was at the beginning of World War I, as the U.S. was lagging in airplane technology to Europe and wanted a reason to become more developed. From the 1910s to 1920s, NACA had many test trials for airplane technology, models and full-scale aircraft both, and began to hire intelligent engineers and scientists to join its crew. From the 1930s to 1940s, the threat of a world war forced rapid development and testing of new aircrafts within the NACA program. After World War II had finally ended in 1945, NACA began to work on supersonic flight. Supersonic flight simply means aircraft that flies faster than the speed of sound. Throughout their whole process, they worked closely with the U.S. Air Force and Bell Aircraft to design the first supersonic aircraft. This was a fairly significant moment for NACA because never before had they gone through the entire process of designing and constructing a research plane. The creation of the aircraft was successful, and NACA contributed a changed tail to the construction of the plane before it flew for the first time. Finally, on October 14, 1947, the first supersonic flight took place in an experimental airplane, the Bell X-1, piloted by Captain Charles E. Chuck Yeager, and was monitored immensely by NACA. Yeager reached a speed considered to be faster than the speed of sound, and all information about it was declared top secret 2 hours later. Eventually, information leaked about the flight in December of 1947, and in March of 1948, the Air Force would confirm all details about Bell X-1. This new accomplishment paved the way for further research into supersonic aircraft, leading to the development of swept wings and a new general shape. With the deepening of the Cold War, NACA looked to develop missile technology and was also focused largely on the tactics and design of re-entry of space vehicles. In addition, NACA was ahead of its time when it looked to eventually put people in space and began to design spacecrafts with greater pilot control for these conditions. This type of newer program did not launch with NACA, but instead with NASA. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite. This was the first human-made object to be put in space, in Earth's orbit, and came as a shock to the United States, as they wanted to take control over space exploration. This started the era of the space race between the Soviets and the US because they fought for mass space control and development. In 1958, the US responded to the fear of falling behind the Soviets in the exploration of outer space by passing the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958 in Congress under Eisenhower, which formed NASA. In all, NACA was the bridge between the planes of World War I and pre-World War I era into all types of aircrafts we use today. NACA officially turned over operations to NASA on October 1, 1958. The new agency would be responsible for human, satellite, and robotic space programs, including space research. NACA was to be incorporated into the new agency. On a bright note, many of NACA's personnel took high-level positions at NASA and were responsible for the earliest decisions regarding the human space program. On April 9, 1959, NASA introduced its first astronaut class, and they are dubbed the Original 7 and Mercury 7. With this, Project Mercury is announced to the public in a press conference in Washington, D.C. The press and public addressed them as heroes with new space exploration and was the first effort by the U.S. to put humans into space frequently. Their objectives included to orbit a spacecraft with humans around the Earth, to investigate a person's ability to function in space, and to recover both the astronaut and spacecraft safely. Displayed here is the logo for the Project Mercury mission. On January 31, 1961, the Holloman Aeromed, or HAM, became the first chimp in space on the Mercury Redstone rocket on a suborbital flight similar to Alan Shepard's. A post-flight medical examination found HAM to be slightly fatigued and dehydrated, but in good shape otherwise. HAM's mission paved the way for the successful launch of America's first human astronaut, Alan B. Shepard, Jr., on May 5, 1961. On April 12, 1961, Russian Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space on Vostok 1, causing further panic in the US. It was considered to be a suborbital flight, not an orbital flight, therefore it traveled at much slower speeds. Suborbital flights do not have the power to send the rocket into full orbit and will instead fly up and come back down when the engines are shut down. At the highest point of their flight, suborbital crew members will feel weightlessness for a few minutes, but will eventually fall back to Earth. The trip lasted 108 minutes and reached an altitude of 202 miles, completing one full orbit. In response, on May 5th, Alan Shepard became the first American in space, but his flight was also suborbital and not orbital. Therefore, he was not the first American to fully orbit the Earth. He traveled on a 15-minute flight, 116 miles in the air, and came back down. Once Shepard's flight was successful, Kennedy made his decision, and Mercury focused on initial objectives needed to get to the moon. To complete the project, more than 2 million people from various government agencies and the aerospace industry made the project possible. During the 5-year life of the project, from 1959 to 1963, 6 manned flights were completed, proving that human spaceflight was in fact possible. On May 25, 1961, Kennedy also challenged Yuri's feat, as he was fearful the Soviet Union would beat the US in space exploration, stating that he would send Americans to the moon before the end of the decade. The US was jealous and wanted to discover more than the Soviets did at the time, as they felt they were losing. It was a very outrageous claim, but an even more outrageous feat. The NASA administrator at the time, James Webb, concluded that it was one area that they had a lead in compared to the Soviets. Enos became the first chimp to orbit the Earth on November 29, 1961, aboard the Mercury Atlas rocket. The mission plan called for 3 orbits, but malfunctions caused NASA to bring Enos back after 2 orbits. He was found to be in good condition, and both he and the Mercury spacecraft came back safely. His mission paved the way for testing a human orbital flight. Astronaut John Glenn was aboard the Friendship 7 Mercury spacecraft on February 20, 1962. Glenn made history by becoming the first U.S. astronaut to orbit Earth after the results of Enos came out. The Mercury mission showed that humans could function for periods up to 32 hours of weightlessness flight. NASA research mathematician Katherine Johnson did the trajectory analysis for Alan Shepard's historic mission. Johnson worked from 1953 to 1986. She and many other women made essential technical contributions to the space program, although they were overlooked, and was the protagonist in the movie Hidden Figures, based on the space race. The Gemini program lasted from 1965 to 1966. It tested equipment, mission procedures, trained astronauts, and ground crews for eventual missions to the moon. Gemini was made for transferring 2 people rather than the 1 person carrying Mercury. The main goals of Gemini were to test the ability to fly long-duration flights, to understand how a spacecraft could dock with another vehicle in orbit, to perfect re-entry landing methods, and to understand the effects of longer spaceflight on astronauts, and to go further into space. Astronauts Gus Grissom and John Young on Gemini 3 crewed the first human Gemini flight on March 23, 1965. This tested new maneuverable spacecraft that let the astronauts control more of the flight. On June 3, 1965, astronaut Ed White on Gemini 4 became the first astronaut to walk in space. The Apollo program lasted from 1961 to 1975 and was one of the greatest milestones for NASA history. It also conducted scientific exploration of the moon and developed their capability to research the moon. From 1961 to 1964, NASA's budget was increased by almost 500%, and the lunar landing program had approximately 34,000 NASA employees and 375,000 contractors. On January 27, 1967, the Apollo program was hit by tragedy as the first crew prepared to fly in Apollo 1. Fire swept through the command system during a pre-flight test on the Cape Kennedy launch pad. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee lost their lives. NASA was not thrown off the rails, but made sure that it changed the program to ensure the safety and success of future missions. On October 19, 1968, Apollo 7 displayed the first live TV broadcast from a human U.S. spacecraft. When the crew entered space, they held up a paper that said, "Keep those cards and letters coming in, folks." On Christmas Eve 1968, although it was one of the most tragic years in American history, millions watched and listened as the astronauts of Apollo 8, the first humans to orbit another world, read from the Bible's book of Genesis to symbolize hope for the new year. On July 20th, 1969, Apollo 11 Commander Neil Armstrong placed the first human footstep on the moon. This was revolutionary because it was the first time astronauts had stepped foot on anything in space besides Earth. After landing successfully, Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon's surface and famously called the moment "one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Him, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were all a part of the Apollo 11 crew. On May 14, 1973, Skylab was launched into Earth's orbit and served as a solar observatory, a microgravity lab, a medical lab, an Earth-observing facility, and most importantly, a home for its residents. The program also led to new technologies such as special showers, toilets, sleeping bags, exercise equipment, and kitchen facilities that were designed to function in microgravity. Skylab had 4 windmill-like solar arrays attached to the Apollo telescope mount. Observations of the sun were one of the lab's main achievements. The Skylab program also proved that humans can live and work in outer space for extended periods of time. The last Skylab crew came back on February 8, 1974. Original plans called for the station to stay in space after this mission for another 8 to 10 years, but extremely high solar activity called for its time to come back. On July 11, 1979, Skylab re-entered the Earth's atmosphere and disintegrated, dispersing debris across Western Australia and the southeastern Indian Ocean. Many people in Europe and Asia were concerned with where precisely Skylab was going to fall because NASA never specified where. NASA itself had to guess where Skylab was going to fall because it spent more time sending it up than realizing how it was going to come back. Skylab was not built for coming back as fast as it did. In all, Skylab paved the way for the International Space Station. In the 1970s, political tensions between the Soviets and the US began to calm down, and competition that led to the space race also decreased. Competition led to cooperation with the Apollo-Soyuz test project on July 15, 1975. Included was an Apollo spacecraft crew of 3 and a Soyuz spacecraft with its crew of 2, and the Soyuz was the primary Soviet spacecraft used for human flight. Astronauts Tom Stafford and Alexei Leonov made their historic handshake in space. The 9-day Apollo-Soyuz mission brought together 2 former spaceflight rivals and paved the way towards international partnerships in space. International collaboration among many nations would become the norm during the Space Shuttle era, and cooperation in human spaceflight with the International Space Station. These partnerships have taught us more about the universe and expanded the possibilities for future exploration into deep space. Over 30 years, NASA had a group of 5 shuttles, Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour, that flew 135 missions and 355 different people into space. This consisted of the new Space Shuttle era. It also consisted of the first reusable spacecraft, launched, recovered, and repaired satellites, and built the first largest structure in space, the International Space Station. Iconic moments in the Space Shuttle era included Sally Ride being the first American woman to enter space in the Space Shuttle Challenger, NASA's 1978 class of astronauts, including the first woman, African Americans, and the first Asian American. All in all, the shuttle brought diversity to space. 24 successful shuttle launches occurred to give valuable information to scientists at NASA until January 28, 1986, when just 73 seconds after liftoff, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded. The crew of 7 The crew of 7 was killed, including a teacher from New Hampshire who would have been the first civilian in space. The Columbia disaster was the second shuttle tragedy. On February 1st, 2003, the shuttle broke apart while re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, killing all 7 crew members. The disaster occurred minutes before it was scheduled to land at the Kennedy Space Center. It was the second loss of a shuttle in 113 flights. After each of the disasters, space shuttle flights were stopped for more than 2 years. The final shuttle mission was completed with the landing of Atlantis on July 21, 2011, closing the 30-year Space Shuttle program. Space launch systems were designed to reduce costs and improve safety. Most U.S. satellites are launched into orbit by various launch vehicles designed for different missions. A shuttle could carry several satellites into low Earth orbit on one flight, and the Gulf War proved the value of satellites. Allies were able to use the high ground of space to achieve an advantage and were used to provide information on enemy movements and warning of enemy missile attacks. The advantages of satellites quickly brought the war to an end, saving many lives. Satellites continue to help defense, weather tracking, and sensing for chemicals, fires, and other disasters. On January 25, 1984, President Ronald Reagan's State of the Union address directed NASA to build an international space station within the next 10 years. The ISS was then created a little more than 10 years after that. The International Space Station is a research laboratory in low Earth orbit, as well as a model for scientific advancements, private industry, cooperation between different countries, and the development of new technologies to help human space exploration. The ISS was built between 1998 and 2011, took 30 missions to assemble, and has housed humans back-to-back since November 2, 2000, meaning that the mission is still ongoing to this day. The space station is approximately the size of a football field, weighs 460 tons, and orbits 250 miles above Earth. It is about 5 times as large as the U.S. Skylab. Because humans function differently in space, research in microgravity helps advance scientific knowledge. NASA has contracted with different commercial companies, SpaceX being the most recent, to deliver investigations, cargo, and supplies, as well as new astronauts to cruise in space. The station is a partnership of 15 nations through NASA, the European Space Agency, the Canadian Space Agency, the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, and the Russian Federal Space Agency. With many different partners contributing to its design and construction, this high-flying laboratory has become a symbol of cooperation in space exploration, with former competitors now working together. The station was built with the help of various spacecraft, astronauts, cosmonauts, and space tourists from 17 different nations. American astronaut Scott Kelly and Russian cosmonaut Mikhail Korenko celebrated their 30th day of working together in space on January 21, 2016. The one-year mission helped identify and reduce the biomedical risks astronauts face during longer space exploration to deep space. Project Constellation ran from 2003 to 2010 and consisted of the goals to put Americans on the moon again and set their eyes on the new goal of Mars and how to reach there. They planned to set foot on the moon again by 2020, but their project was cut by the Obama administration as the project was overdue with no results, and cut Constellation out of its budgeting for the 2010 fiscal year. The 3 end parentheses shown in the logo display the Earth, the Moon, and Mars, in that order. The Artemis project began in 2017 and is active to this day. With the project, they plan to send instruments, experiments, and hopefully humans to the moon by 2024. Since the last Space Shuttle mission in 2011, SpaceX was the first company to launch a spacecraft, with a crew inside from the Kennedy Launch Center, and was the first commercial company to do so, carrying Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley. Mars and the Moon are the focus of modern space exploration, and manned Mars exploration is a long-term goal of the United States. NASA is on a journey to Mars, with a goal of sending humans to the planet in the 2030s. NASA has already sent rovers there, increasing our knowledge about the planet. Many more missions are in the future of NASA, but they also have a rich history that will help them explore many more experiments and places in the future. Thank you.